Welcome to Human Potential at Work, the show where we explore social impact, inclusion, and empowerment of everyone, including persons with disabilities. Your host is Deborah Rue, CEO of Rue Global Impact, and co-founder and chairwoman of Billion Strong, an identity and empowerment organization designed to bring billions of voices of persons with disabilities together. To join the global community and to donate to the cause, visit billion-strong.org. That's billion-strong.org. And now, on to the episode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Deborah Rue, and I'm the CEO of Rue Global Impact, which is a global organization that focuses on disability inclusion in a very strategic way. And I'm also the executive chair of the newly organized Billion-Strong, a global organization that brings together the entire 1.2 to 1.7 billion people in the world with disabilities in a meaningful way, really allowing us to be proud of our lived experiences, whatever that means. And so today I'm really excited about my guest. I did not know about her work. So maybe you don't know about her work, but her publicist approached me and said, "Do you know about her work?" And I was like, "No, but I really love what she's doing." She is also an author, and we want to let her tell us about the book. And I just really appreciate the work she's doing. And so I hope you do as well. So Martine Kayla, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah.
Yes, thank you for being here. And I really appreciate the work you're doing. And you're the CEO and founder of MLK Enterprises. But what do y'all do?
Yeah, so MLK Enterprises is a boutique firm that supports human resources professionals. Ultimately, what we say is we help human resources professionals reduce the burden, save time, and gain confidence in driving diversity, equity, and inclusion in their workspaces. And we do that through training and consulting. Oftentimes, in this new, more recent era of DEI, a lot of the responsibility has been pushed to human resource professionals who are really already struggling to secure a seat at the table for the most part. Mm-hmm. They already have a huge workload under their belt, and they don't always have the experience or the expertise to drive DEI. So then they're given this responsibility. It's almost positioned as an extracurricular activity, and they're expected to make magic, and
I agree. And know everything.
Absolutely. And it can feel really burdensome. So what we try to do is alleviate that burden and help human resources professionals position DEI as a business structure, a business imperative that has a return on investment.
Ooh, so true. And explain to me how you are defining DEI, and I'll tell you why I'm asking you that.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, diversity, equity, and inclusion I think it's a three-legged stool. You need each of them. So historically, we've seen organizations take initiative around diversity, and diversity really is about representation. And organizations want diversity or need diversity because what we want to do is to cast the widest net across the globe, across the nation, to find the best and most qualified and smartest people who can help drive our business. But diversity alone is not going to sustain and keep people. People also need representation. They need to feel welcome. They need to feel like they belong. So that's the inclusion element. But equity is one way to ensure that people feel like they belong because they're treated fairly. And what we know is that historically, especially in the United States, but also across the globe, there have been systemic inequities that have trickled into the workforce. So equity looks like undoing that, fixing that, trying to find a way to create fairness. And so when we have true diversity, equity, and inclusion, we can have an actual multicultural organization that's not focused on assimilation, but truly multiculturalism. So that's how I define DEI.
Yeah, very powerful. And something I forgot again is to take the time to describe myself for the audience members that might not be able to see, or maybe they're listening via podcast or they have vision impairment. And so I just want to do that because I also want you to describe yourself. And so I am a white woman in my 60s, and I've got gray and purple hair. and a blue and black top on. But let me let you do that, because this is something also that deals with this topic. And I always forget to do that. Sorry.
Hopefully my voice illustrates a little bit about my physical presence. I'm a brown skinned woman from Zambia and Congo. I would say that I'm more of a chocolate brown skin tone. I have a big bright smile. I love to laugh and have long dark hair. And let's see, anything else? No, I'm all smiles usually most of the time.
And it's interesting how people describe themselves too. I always find it very interesting what they choose to describe. And I think it's a powerful thing to do so that others can feel included. And my coworker, Jasmine, who's blind and she lives in the Philippines, I asked her one time if she thought it was a silly exercise or did she think it added value. And she said, I love when people take the time to do that. She said, it makes me feel more welcome. So I thought, okay, remember to do it, Deborah.
Brilliant. I think that we get to, if we existed in a world where we could allow people to define themselves first before we decided to define them, that is DEI. That would be the perfect entry point, and not solely for the visually impaired, but for
all of us. I know. Because once again, every time you do something to include a group that has been disenfranchised, it benefits all of us. And that's something else I want to talk about. And I'm going to talk about your book too. But I just want to tell you that the other day I had a group reach out to me and say, we provide DEI training. And so what we'd like to do is we would like to partner with you and you take it to your big corporate clients. And so, of course, I have to ask this one question. Okay, are people with disabilities included in your training? And so it took them a little while, but they came back because I know they didn't want to answer. And they were like, well, not now, but, and I said, you don't want us to recommend you. And by the way, we would never recommend you because you're not including us. And right. And so then they said, we're going to do it later. And that's what always happened. I feel often happens to my community, but this has been happening to the brown and black community and the LGBT community. But it chills me how DEI conversations are being had and not including the diverse groups. And we talked about, I know you and I talked about that a little bit off air. And I like the way you are recommending that corporations implement or employers implement it and support their HR representatives, because we, as you said, we make it impossible for them. Okay, make sure you're including the brown. Nope, now women. No, now LGBT. We keep changing. And the reality, as we also have talked about on this, and you talk about in your book, and I want to go ahead and mention your book, The ABCs of Diversity, A Manager's Guide to Diversity, Equity, Inclusion in the New Workplace. Yes. And I want to remind everybody, please go out and buy your book, but also please do positive reviews, because that's how others find her book. It's very important to do that.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to say, especially considering the audience and us really truly being diverse, thinking about diversity, there's also an audiobook. So the audiobook is available. Wow.
Okay, cool. And people, I love an audiobook because I have tired eyes, I have dry eyes, and audiobooks I like listening to stories. So I personally prefer an audiobook over reading a book just because of me. So it's so important. Plus, of course, you can also get it on a Kindle but once again, I know I always nag about this, but your reviews matter so much because that's how the algorithms work. So if you do reviews, it really does help us. And also, if you like her book, do a social media post about her book, because that's how we help each other. So I just wanted to say that. But so tell us more about your book, because I agree with what you're saying. We say to our HR representatives, you need to do this and this and this and this, and you better get it right.
Yeah.
And when society doesn't know how to do this.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think we're in a climate where we're in the midst of this great resignation in the workplace.
Yes.
I am happy and proud of the fact that employees are holding their leadership accountable, right? I'm happy that employees are more hyper aware of their organization and what they're doing around DEI. However, what ends up happening or what might happen in some instances is that organizations they become reactive. And when we're reactive and not proactive, we're not really thinking through strategy. And so therefore, there's this level of reactivity, and then we give the responsibility to human resources without really equipping them with anything. So
Right.
what I believe is that similarly to any other business structure, so let's say this whole emphasis on security, data security in the workplace, it's fairly recent within the last 15 years. No one says in terms of data security in the workplace, it's the right thing to do. And then just have a bunch of great programs and without any strategy, without really looking at the cost and benefit, without looking at the metrics, right? There's a lot of thought put into every element of it. And so that's what what I encourage human resources professionals to challenge their organizations in doing, right? Really seeing DEI as both the right thing to do, but it becomes a business structure. Now, some people think that cheapens DEI. My argument or my rebuttal is, well, how has it worked for us so far when we just focus on it being the right thing to do? When we position DEI as the right thing to do, what could happen and what often happens is that some people feel excluded. And when we think about the makeup of organizations and who sits at the helm of organizations, it's usually traditionally white men, cisgendered, right? Able-bodied.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they feel, and I've had plenty of white men who are cisgendered, able-bodied, who I've worked with across organizations come to me and say, I don't feel like I have the right to say anything. I don't want to say the wrong thing. So when we position DEI as solely the right thing to do, oftentimes we're preaching to the choir. The same people who have been discussing it are the only people that are engaged in the conversation. Secondly, some people feel marginalized from the conversation because they don't want to be shamed, blamed, or say the wrong thing. And then thirdly, it becomes a should. Let's all think about all the shoulds that we have in our lives.
I hate all the shooting.
In terms of priority. Exactly. So that is why when we position it as just the right thing to do, we don't have strategy. We have a lot of programs that can't be scaled. And so what I really believe is that diversity, going back to what you said, it should be inclusive of every different underrepresented community. Now, DEI is a huge ecosystem. So we've got to think about how we enter this conversation. And so my argument is when we enter it from the standpoint of, let's talk about the return on investment first. Let's make sure that we are all speaking the same language, the business language. What's the return on investment? What's the financial impact? Because once we are all committed to it, we all understand that there's a financial benefit to bringing in the best people and casting a wider net and mitigating our biases. Now we can start talking about the stories, the experiences, and how can we embed these stories and experiences in the emotional intelligence part of this conversation. It can be done through our managers, right?
Right.
Our managers really influence the makeup of the organization, right? Our managers and human resources combined influence hiring decisions, performance management decisions, compensation decisions. When a person decides to attrit an organization, leave an organization, it has a lot to do with their experience with their managers. So that is where we can start to reinforce that emotional intelligence portion of it. And lastly, to one point that you made where you said you asked an organization, do you include individuals who are with disabilities in your conversation? I really believe diversity, equity, and inclusion should be positioned as learning, not training. It becomes a conversation. It becomes an opportunity for everyone to learn. We're always on this continuum, right, of learning. And when you position it as learning, where everyone is on a continuum, people can interject their experiences, their stories, because not one person sits at every intersection of every marginalized or underrepresented group. So we've got to create the space where we can hear each other's experiences. So when I do my diversity, equity, and include workshops and discussions, it's not solely focusing on one particular area. Certainly I can speak to the communities in which I sit, right, where I am underrepresented. But that's not the extent of it. What I say is that we can all be allies. We can all be active allies to a particular group. And so when we think about and walk into the conversation from that perspective, we're much more inclined to want to understand what are all the other different and underrepresented groups that we can align ourselves with and be allies for.
Yeah, so well said. And I talk a lot on this show about the Great Resignation. And I also believe we're having a great awakening, but that's a
Oh,
different,
I love that.
that's a different one,
Yeah.
show. But I do talk a lot about the Great Resignation because what we're seeing is the younger generations saying, "Yeah, I'm not going to work for you if you're a bad player. If you're
Yeah.
doing bad stuff, there's sexual abuse and you're ignoring, I'm not working for you." And I admire the younger generation so much for that because my generation also thought that, but we just didn't think anybody cared what we thought, honestly. And so I love how brave the younger generations are being, and the employers are totally freaked out about this, as you can imagine. There are job openings all over the world. It's really intense. But what I'm wondering from your viewpoint is how does making sure that we're including everyone? And of course, I am making some assumptions here. You're hiring qualified people. I'm not asking you not to hire qualified people, but you're hiring qualified, diverse people because they have been underrepresented. They have value to your organization. But if they could get that part, really make sure that people were included, that they were accommodated, that they were valued,
That's right.
how does that tie into the younger generations with what we're happening with this Great Resignation? And it's also interesting to note with the Great Resignation, the only group that wasn't going anywhere, which is funny too, were people like over 65. They weren't planning to go anywhere. People over 65 are still having to work because we want to work. I'm not over 65 yet, but I found that fascinating. That was the only stable. Well, of course, because that's the end of their work career. We used to think it was 55 anyway, but how can that make a difference to these employers that are really freaked out about this?
Yeah. So I will say that I love that you emphasize the younger generation because generation is also an element of diversity category, right? Some organizations lean towards a younger generation. However, we define younger generation, maybe it's post college to like 30, you know,
Right.
and some organizations. So this is, we can also consider that and consider where we can have greater representation in organizations across generations. So what I think and what I observe is that as I mentioned earlier, when organizations are reactive, then they're trying to do this plug and play. Let's plug in all these programs. Let's give money. Let's do some philanthropy. Let's give money to this organization. But what ends up happening is that can end up hurting all organizations because we're not able to sustain it. We're not able to scale it because there's a lack of strategy. And when we do it that way, when we take that approach, which sometimes can come across and sometimes is a quota-like approach.
Mhm.
Let's plug and play this person from this underrepresented group because our population is pressuring us to have more diversity, equity, and inclusion. When we take that approach as an organization, then we're really not understanding our bias. We're not mitigating our bias. We're not understanding the history of lack of diversity, of racism, of xenophobia, of discrimination. We're not really getting it. So what we end up doing is we're setting up that one person to fail, right?
Yes.
Because that person ends up coming in, whether they're tokenized or whether they're just seen as different, an exception to the community that they're part of, right? Because they're either working against the stereotype or they fall into the stereotype that we perceive of them because we haven't done any work. We're simply just trying to plug and play as an organization. So what ends up happening is that we set that person up to fail. We set everybody up to fail. One, we set the precedents where some individuals believe, some of our employees start to believe that, oh, so diversity means quotas. And that means we're bringing in less qualified people
Right. Right.
to take our positions. It's
Right.
not true, but that's how we end up when we set a precedence by saying, hey, we're bringing in this person who has particular neurodiversity, or this person who is a woman, or this person who's Black, or this person who's blind. We're making that exception, so to speak, and we're so great. And it's very performative. That is one precedent we could set for the rest of our employees. That's what diversity starts to mean to them, which is not true. Two, we set that one person up to fail because there's lack of representation. They're the only one. So they're going to either have to overcompensate, right? And try to work against that stereotype that we see them as, which is a huge burden for someone, so that they can always be seen as the exception,
Right.
which is that as long as they're the exception, there's no room for anyone else like them, right? Because they're unique. Or they constantly fit into or feed into this stereotype that we have of them, which means that we're never going to allow them to excel further than our minds allow us to, based on that stereotype we have of them. So in essence, we set all of us, everyone up to fail, ourselves, the organization, and that individual.
And we don't advance the cause at all.
Advanced. So what we want to do, and going back to why DEI is this three-legged stool, is diversity itself is not enough, right? And when we mean diversity, it means casting a wider net. What does that look like? That looks like when mitigating your biases, having managers understand that when we look at resumes, we create a story, a picture in our mind about who that person is, what they look like, and we generally have a certain affinity to someone, or we don't. And how do we mitigate those biases? When we're writing job descriptions, we can think about, what is that? How do we limit ourselves, right? How are we setting parameters and limitations to having more people apply for this position? Because studies show that cisgender white men are more likely to apply for positions where the description is slightly out of their reach, whereas other groups of individuals are likely to feel like they have to meet all the criteria or they don't apply. So how does that influence how we write the job descriptions? So that's what we mean by widening the pool. And when we do that, if we have more candidates that are qualified, that are smart, but come from a wider pool, then we're more likely to hire more representation across different diversity attributes who are also qualified for the position. That's what diversity needs. But when they come in, if they don't have anyone that looks like them, right? And if they if they don't feel like there's representation, if they feel like they're not being given the same treatment as other people in terms of growing within the organization, being promoted, right? Fair compensation, access to leadership, right? Mentorship programs, all of those types of things, then they're not going to want to stay. Then they leave. And so that's how it ties back to this younger generation that's holding leaders accountable, holding our feet to the fire, because they're saying, hey, we see this. They're reading Glassdoor. They're looking at the reviews to decide whether they're going to join an organization.
They're quitting your organization if you ignore things.
Yeah.
They're going to walk out on you. They're going to leave you, and they will work for themselves. I'm just so impressed because I didn't know we could do this. So, maybe we could have done this before, but God bless them.
It's the timing of everything, right? Historically, we look at everything that happened from the time the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. That's an international conversation. But what I do want to remind and encourage employers is that reacting is not the solution. Employees are really smart. They can tell when things are performative, when our actions are performative, and when they're thoughtful. So it doesn't mean we have to fix everything overnight. That's not what our employees are expecting. What they're expecting is authentic, thoughtful leadership around this. They want a level of transparency wherever we can give it, to share, hey, this is our strategy, this is our plan, just like we would with any other business structure. That is what looks authentic. But when we're plugging in all these great programs, but we're not clear on how we're going to sustain them or how they tie back to strategy, that's when it can seem, a little inauthentic and disingenuous. So
I
that's
agree. I agree.
different.
I remember one time I was on stage and I've said this on air before, but I was on stage and before a lot of corporate employers, and somebody asked the question, where do we start? And when they asked that question, the microphone was with another person. And so they said, just go out and hire people with disabilities,
Oh my
which,
God.
by the way, I know, I understand that answer, but
Yeah.
it came to me luckily next. And I said, you're a business. When you are going to do something, you should have a strategy. You should have a plan so you can see, you don't just go out and do something, because that's how you're going to get in a lot of trouble. And luckily there was a lawyer sitting next to me. So I said, that's when you're going to go talk to him.
Right.
Because that's not way business, it doesn't work. Business doesn't work that way. And a lot of vendors, DEI vendors, they don't seem to understand how business really works. That's one reason I was really impressed with you, because you were looking at this once again. This is strategy and process and making sure your HR reps can be successful in this.
Yeah.
And there's so many moving parts with all these groups, but at the same time, at a time when we're digging into identity, really I'm so proud that we're doing Billion-Strong, and Martine said she's going to join us and support us so we can talk about her work there, because we're stronger together. We're
Okay.
stronger together. So I know that I'm probably keeping you longer, but I
No,
want
this
to
is
talk just a little bit about identity. So
yeah.
why does that matter for us to tell the world who we are? Can I say that I'm a woman over 60? I used to say, just for an example, I remember when I turned 60, I thought, can I say I'm middle-aged anymore? Am I going to live to 120? And I remember, because I wanted to be authentic. I want to be authentic. And so I wonder, as we are really breaking down who we are and who we really are as individuals, and our expectations of our employers. And I just am fascinated with the identity part of the conversation.
It's so powerful. I already have my third book
Oh,
mine because, I really, for me, the illustration of identity and the power of identity was so interesting for me as I traveled across the globe, going from Dubai and seeing how people perceive me versus going to Colombia and seeing how people perceive me versus Cape Town, South Africa. Identity is so powerful. And the thing is, we're at a time in our history, in our world, where globalization is at its greatest, at its height, right? Um, they sit at intersections of so many things, right?
Right.
When we look at people nowadays, the majority of people, and studies show that this will continue to progress as a result of globalization, as a result of social media, people start to resemble each other and across different diversity categories. Also, because of more people sit at the intersection of different diversity attributes. So what we see isn't exactly necessarily what is. So rather than us deciding what that person is, who that person is, why don't we allow them to define themselves? One, it allows us to really have more appreciation of what diversity really means in our organization, what it really looks like, and the different elements and intersections of the diversity. Two, it alleviates that burden that we carry around DEI, where we don't want to say the wrong thing. We don't want to label someone the wrong thing. We don't know what to say. We don't want to say if we were just able to ask someone, find the language
Right.
that allowed us to not assume, but to allow the person to define themselves, how much easier would that be? And that's what I talk about in my book. When people go, Martine, I don't know, do I refer to you as African-American? Are you Black? Are you African? I'm not sure. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I go, of course, we're all bound to say the wrong thing at some point.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why the best thing to do is just ask the person. It's asking permission to ask the person.
So
And then
I agree.
it does is it allows us to not sit in that space of color blindness, just having this belief that we're all one and we're all the same. Because when we assume that, we are denying people of their identities. So it's okay for us to be different. and unique. But what is not okay is for us to make a certain association with what somebody's differences means, like whether it's good or bad. That's the
Good point. Good point.
So when we allow people to define themselves, we can appreciate that. For me to say, oh, I'm an African woman, I'm a Black woman, I'm right. You can appreciate that rather than feeling, oh, I'm not supposed to acknowledge that
Right.
she's
Right.
Black because I don't
Because
want
you
her
told me who you
defend-
are.
defending her.
Right.
Absolutely. I'm telling you who I am.
I just think that's so
It
powerful.
will allow us to navigate a little bit more confidently in the world if we just let people define themselves, because no two people that might seemingly look like they're the same define themselves the same. Someone who might look identical to me, and you might ask them to define themselves, and they might say, I'm a woman and I'm a woman. And that's their definer
Right.
and their primary definer. Whereas my primary definer might be that I am Black and I'm a woman. So we allow people to really define themselves. And I started off with saying that the illustration of that was my travels, because what I noticed is when I went to certain parts of the world, certain people would define me, right, based on their realm of knowledge, the context and the people that they're accustomed to. Then in other parts of the world I would travel to, that was truly global, and their population's truly diverse. They didn't know where to box me. So they asked me to define that myself. Where are you from? What
Right.
part of the world are you from here? And that was the best assumption. Like, the best thing we could ever do is confuse someone as being part of us. That
I
is
agree. I agree.
never something that a person will be, well, I won't say never,
I can't imagine. Yeah.
right?
I agree. I remember I was in Sharjah in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates.
Yes.
And a
Yeah.
woman, I was just walking, and a woman came by and she stopped me and she's like, "Are you Russian?" And I was like, "No, but I love that you thought I was Russian right now." No, but it's not the Russian people. It's not the Russian people. So
Absolutely.
yeah, it's, what bad leaders are doing all over the world. That's
Yeah.
bad leaders. It's not the people.
No,
But I remember being delighted that she thought I was,
I
even
mean,
though I'm like, no, I'm an American, but
you know, it's funny because when I was thinking back to my experience of where I was confused for being part of a community, it wasn't in the UAE. It was Sharjah, or it was
oh, I
in
love Sharjah.
But everyone asked me, a lot of people kept asking me, are you from here? Are you from the UAE? And I kept thinking, wow, that is amazing. Even in the US, I don't get people assuming that I'm American. And the reason why is because I think it's 90% of individuals in the UAE are expats. So space where everyone comes from everywhere. So it was that experience of just being people assuming that I was from there or from anywhere. And also when I was in Bogota, Colombia, where
Oh, yes.
again, people approached me and asked me if I was Colombian. And I thought,
I could see that. I can see that.
I've never had, because I went through my entire journey of I was stateless and undocumented in the US for many years of my life. I struggled and fought for people to see me as American. And even now I'm a US citizen, and people always ask me where I'm from in the US. To go to another part of the world in Bogota, Colombia, and have Colombians just assume that I was one of them.
I love Colombians.
How
Oh, I love the Colombian people. I've been to Barranquilla. Oh, and they're
love-
beautiful people too. They're beautiful people. So I can see why. But I know I kept you a lot longer, but I want to, first of all, you're global. Your work is global. So if you want to reach out to Martine and you're outside the US, she is global. But I want to allow you now to tell us how to get your book, how to connect with you, what's your website, your social media, and also give you the last words, because I really appreciate your work and I appreciate partnering with you with Billion Strong too. So
Thank you, Deborah. I'm very much looking forward to following up with you and learning and being a part of Billion Strong. Just kudos to you for building such a platform. So I'll make it really simple because I know there's so much to retain from this conversation. You can pick up my book, The ABCs of Diversity, A Manager's Guide to Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, on Amazon. And also the audiobook is available on audible.com. But you can go straight to my website at martinecalau.com. And You can go there and you can access the link to purchase my book, go to purchase my audiobook. So it's easy. That's a one-stop shop. And that's where you can also go to sign up for my complimentary 1-hour masterclass. So my next masterclass is on April 27th. It's 1 hour from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if for whatever reason it falls out of your time zone, if you're in Brisbane or somewhere else in Singapore and that time doesn't work for you, you can also go to my website and schedule a one-on-one consultation with me or someone on my team. Would love to have you. And the last piece of, I would say the last nugget of information I would share with you is, Deborah, you mentioned earlier that you were at a conference and someone asked, where do we start in terms of DEI in our organization? I would say that where I recommend starting is with the metrics. Start with the numbers. Start with not just looking at that superficial level of information, like what's our gender equity across our organization. While that's important information, we can dig deeper. We can look at the cross section of information. As you started off saying, you can look at gender and ableness and race, right? If you look at those layers, and then you look at ability, promotion, right? The history of the trajectory of promotion within a particular department, looking at those three, cross sections of information, that tells a very powerful story. And the reason we want to do that, right? Why we want to tell that story and actually see, right? It's not going to be a pretty picture when we look at it initially, is because when we are able to address that, we're able to address where we have a gap, we're going to be able to drive our business. We're going to be able to find the best top talent and drive our business, drive our numbers. And it's okay for us to drive our numbers through our efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion as well.
I agree, because that's real. That's how you really do it. So thank you, Martine. Thank you so much for your work. I love letting my guests know about people that are really making a difference. And so I really appreciate what you're doing. And we're all stronger together. We're all stronger together. All right. I look forward to continuing this conversation, and you have a lovely day, and we will talk to everybody soon.
You too. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Human Potential at Work. To learn more about Rue Global Impact, visit rueglobal.com. And to learn more about Billion Strong, an identity and empowerment organization designed to bring the billions of voices of persons with disabilities together, you can join the global community and donate at billion-strong.org. That's billion-strong.org.